Welcome to KPOV's Critical Conversations podcast, dedicated to featuring unique perspectives, challenging mundane thought, and questioning the norm. Listen at kpov.org, on YouTube, or on your favorite podcast app.
Well, I'm Jackie Elliott here with my co-host Carolyn Esky, and today City Councilor Mike Riley and City Planner BreAnne Gale join us for the Bend City Report, which happens once a month, usually on the third Friday. Growth is the topic that is discussed at every brewery, every coffee table,
cocktail parties,
everywhere. Yeah, the growth of Bend. So, welcome to the point, Mike Riley and BreAnne Gale.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. So, since we're going to talk about growth, Mike, I'm real curious. Where is Bend growing now?
Well, we thought it would be great to just start off with kind of some examples of that. And really, there's two things that are happening. We did some planning a few years ago around our urban growth boundary, which is something required under state law, where we decide what part of a community and cities where we're going to have urbanized growth, and then everything outside that, basically, we can't have that same scale of growth to protect forest and farmland. That's a pretty simple overview. But and so we expanded the urban growth boundary in 2016 a bit, and we targeted some areas for what were called expansion areas, the areas that we're going to grow on the edges. But there's also a lot of growth happening in the core. So I thought we would talk about two examples to kind of get at that, the edges and the core. And the edges, there's a development that many people may have seen if you've been down in the southeast part of town at all on 27th Street. Like if you're going on 27th south towards the landfill, you've noticed a bunch of development happening to the east there. There's two tracts of land there that are developing. The first tract is the one that's closer to 27th. That whole area generally is referred to as the Stevens Ranch area. The parcels have slightly different terms that people use. But there's a lot of development that's going to happen there, a mix of industrial and residential. And I thought, BreAnne, do you want to talk a little bit more about a little more detail on it?
Sure. So the Stevens Ranch project, that's the one that you're seeing where they're currently moving dirt and doing some development there. That's already inside city limits. It's one of our 10 expansion areas that Mike had mentioned that came into the city's urban growth boundary back in 2016. And so what's planned there is about 1,700 units. There's a mix of commercial land, mostly along 27th will be some commercial land, some retail, some businesses, and then housing and some industrial land as well.
BreAnne, is that 1,700? That's housing units.
1,700 housing units. So it's a mix of single family, some townhomes, middle housing, and then some apartments and multifamily housing as well. And that parcel is about 375 acres. So it's a decent size.
Yeah.
And the thing that I find really interesting is that it's going to be, you said it'll include retail, industrial, housing at all levels. And what I remember as I listened to that wonderful, extensive work taping that you all have to go through. I have such good respect for city councilors and people who work for the city. I mean, my amazement as I listened was, wow, you guys have to do a lot. So back to my question, the goal is to reduce the amount of driving, in part, right?
Right. So the idea is to have more complete communities. Yeah. So there's beyond Stevens Ranch, what I just mentioned, there's Stevens Road Track. What Mike was saying, there's actually 2 master plans out there. So this one is an additional complete community that's a little bit unique. The state passed some legislation a few years ago that allowed Bend to kind of go through this more expedited process. And the whole idea is that it would be a very complete community so that it would have jobs, people could live, work, play, all in that area without having to rely too heavily on a car. And that one I'm happy to go into a little bit more. It's a really interesting project.
Yeah, and there's a lot of affordable housing that was built into that, which was one of the key pieces of that piece of legislation. So there's about 700 of the housing units that are going to be out there that will be designated affordable. And I think generally that means they're about, probably 120% of AMI or area median income or lower, and it may even be a lower threshold than that. I don't remember that.
Yeah,
specific.
This one's even lower. So that was part of it. If they were to come in order to bring them into the UGB, they had to provide 700 or more affordable units, and it was actually 80 percent or less of AMI, which is about $72,000 right now.
Yeah.
Affordable housing, how do you regulate that? I mean, I imagine the first people who buy the houses, is there some criteria, and then they buy the houses at, say, $300,000? Can they then sell them at a profit? How do you make sure that the builders are keeping it affordable?
So these ones, they'll actually be a requirement that they'll be deed restricted. So it'll be with the deed. So you won't be able to actually, if someone buys it, it'll run with the land and they'll actually have to maintain it at a certain price point.
Is there a percentage?
It's at that 80% AMI.
Okay.
Yeah, and many of them, there's a good chance that many of them will actually be rental units as well. So that's one of the ways that gets controlled. So there's some there's affordability or income criteria that are required in order to access a piece of property, to live in a place like that. You're not going to be able to come if you have an income above those kind of thresholds. And it's that deed restriction. And there's usually a time limit where eventually that deed restriction will go away, but they're, 20 plus years or longer. Sometimes they're much longer than that.
And I know in September, we're going to be talking more about affordability in Bend. So all of you listening right now, think about your questions and send them in.
And certainly part of the challenge, I mean, there's both demand and supply, right? And so supply, broadly speaking, across the country, we've been under building housing. Oregon is one of the states that's got one of the larger numbers of underbuilt that we've not supplied enough housing. So that's certainly influencing the price. I think here in Bend, the other part of it, though, is the demand is very high here. As we all know, we've been a Zoom town, right, during the pandemic and stuff, and a lot of people coming in with cash to make offers on homes here. So it just really driving up the prices. The demand's very high. And I don't know that that's going to go away anytime soon. So that whole challenge of how do we walk that dance? I mean, I have experience as an employer here where it's harder and harder to either attract people or keep people because housing costs are so high. And that's also, and I work for a nonprofit. We're trying to pay a lot better, but at the city where they're still paying pretty competitive wages, even there it's hard to attract employees and or retain them over time because it's so expensive. So it's a real issue, but supply is part of it. We do need to build more housing. That's kind of partly what we're talking about today is the supply end of things.
Supply and I would say providing more housing choices. So that's a big thing that we work on is just making sure that there's a variety of housing types. In these expansion areas, we actually have policies that require different types of housing so that someone can't just come and build, all single family at a certain price point. There's a required mix that you would provide apartments or, multifamily or middle housing, which townhomes or cottage developments, those types of things, those tend to be a little bit more affordable than the traditional kind of standalone single family.
And are those are in place now?
Those policies are in place. So when we expand our urban growth boundary, we adopt specific policies for all of our expansion areas that are pretty they are very closely monitored. So when someone wants to come in with a development, we require that they meet at least those minimums. And
that was a big shift in the urban growth boundary work that was done and approved back in 2016 was to say we're trying to move away from a very high percentage of single-family residential homes to, over time, having that percentage of our housing mix get smaller and the other types of multifamily, whether that's a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, apartments, townhomes, having those parts of the housing mix become a bigger percentage so that we do have a lot more choice for people. That was somewhat controversial. It's very different for Bend. We didn't have then as much experience amongst the builders and developer community building that kind of housing here. So it's new for us. And that really is starting to shift. There's been a lot more of that stuff either built or in the pipeline to be built. So the shift is really starting to happen.
And I know last time you were here, we talked about, people are saying, oh, there's so much open space outside. And you explained the UGB, the urban growth boundaries, and also the requirements that need to be submitted to the state for them to approve an expansion.
Right.
And that's fascinating. And so we are going up. I mean, the goal is to go up rather than spread out like LA or something.
Yeah, and that was kind of getting at the second example that we wanted to talk about with some development kind of in the core.
So tell us what's happening here.
I mean, that's one of the other areas that was targeted for growth. It's sort of one of the things that came from the last UGB expansion project was initially the city tried to expand about 8,000 acres, and the state has ultimately said, after many other people said the same thing, that's way too many. You have a lot more infill and redevelopment you could do inside your existing urban growth boundary, so we'll let you expand, but not by so much. And so there's also been a big focus on how do we do more infill development. And so the area around Colorado and Arizona, just to the south of there, the old Core Pine area, there's a lot happening there right now. That's another place where you're starting to see cranes, for example. I just saw them the other day now. And so we wanted to talk a little bit more about the details of that.
Sure. So that area was called Core Pine. In our 2016 UGB expansion, we looked kind of specifically at some areas that we call opportunity areas for this infill and more kind of intense development. And right now you're seeing at that old Spoken Moto site, there's a new mixed-use building coming in. It's a 7-story mixed-use building with ground floor commercial, has over 300 multifamily units. It should be a really interesting project, kind of a new type of project for Bend. And then kind of past there, if you can see when you're driving on Arizona, you're starting to see a lot of movement, a lot of dirt starting to move around at what we call Core Pine, but now it's a developer or a development called Timber Yards. So you'll probably start to hear that more and more. That's a master plan that was approved. And it's about a 32-acre infill site, so it's been vacant now for a few years. Mm-hmm. And it's planned to have 1,600 units, a hotel, some commercial. It should be a pretty neat project.
And it's also multi-story. All those the buildings in there are all going to be, 5 to 7 stories, and apartments, condos, that kind of stuff.
Wow, that's pretty high for Bend.
Yep.
Driving. I mean, is there any objection to that? I mean, it seems like 5-story would be like the limit that I would feel comfortable with.
We had no opposition that I recall at the hearing for Timber Yards in particular. Not that people aren't concerned about height, but it is one of the ways that we can provide more housing types, right? And how we can not sprawl and still meet the need that for future growth, but also the underproduction of housing units that I was talking about that's happened, that we have to deal with in the community. And that undersupply is, as I said, part of what gets to the higher prices here. It's not the only reason. Demand's a big part of it, right? So how do we get a mix of housing types? And that's what we're going to see more of.
Right. And we already have a few examples of that type of building in town, and we'll probably start to see there's a handful that are under construction too over in the central west side over by OSU Cascade. So we have the Hickson on 14th and the Eddy kind of by the Playwave by the river. So we'll likely, or we will see more and more of that type of development. There's quite a bit in the development pipeline right now.
Is there a cap on the height?
The various zones I do think have some limits, and then depending on some of the things that developers might agree to do, in some places they may be able to get a bonus of some kind and go a little bit higher, especially around affordability. And those are some of the kinds of things we can look at as a city council. But
we do have height restrictions in all of our zones. Those mixed-use zones, those opportunity areas, which quite a few of the opportunity areas are mixed-use zones. I believe it's 65 feet, and then there's some bonuses if you do affordable housing and some other types of bonuses.
So they can get a little bit higher and produce more units, and that's sort of how a developer would be able to make a project what people call pencil, meaning that it works financially to do those affordable units because they can generate less income off of them. So they can get a few more units if they do deed-restricted affordable housing. We give them a little bit more credit. So it's a way to incentivize that, to make that a part of the actual development.
Are you struggling with NIMBYism? Is there anybody who's saying, not in my backyard here?
I haven't seen it much in those areas. We did so much planning for this. This is a long time coming. So this is now it's finally coming to fruition. But this was years of planning prior to 2016 where we were determining what those heights were and what these would look like. It went through an extensive public engagement process, thousands of meetings really between all of the technical advisory committees and the public and the council meetings. So I think there was a lot of community input at that time, but that's something that happens.
And we have seen some. I think the development there that's above the river by the Colorado River crossing, above the parks there and the play wave and stuff. There was quite a bit of number of people who were upset about the heights there and concerned it was going to cast shadows all over the river. It's an interesting challenge with NIMBYism. There's something valuable, very valuable, people wanting to protect their backyard, right? Because that's how we look out for things. We don't want bad things to happen where we live, but it can go too far. And I think, we're no change at all. And I do think that the vertical height stuff that's going to happen, in some respects, maybe some of the biggest changes we're going to experience as a community. It's going to make the community is going to be very different look. Parts of it, it's not going to be everywhere, right? We are going to concentrate that in these kind of core areas. I think we'll probably see some height stuff in some of the expansion areas that are these complete community ideas. But so it won't be everywhere, but it is going to be allowed in certain places. Another one of the opportunity areas that BreAnne mentioned was over there by OSU Cascade. So we were seeing some of that happen there as well. But it is a significant change for sure, and I think something we're all going to have to deal with. And those of us who've been here longer, it's going to be harder. People who are coming from cities where they're more used to that, it's not as big a change, and we have more and more people like that, right? I was at an event last night, a different topic, and more than half of the people who raised their hands have been here for 5 years or less. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Now, one of the things that is required by the state, and I know the state has a lot to do with how you move forward. In fact, one of the themes that I heard often in that that meeting that you had, the exploratory meeting, is that you still have to wait until next year for the state to come out with some regulations. But one of the regulations in the urban core is the idea of climate-friendly areas. What's that about?
Sure. So climate-friendly areas came out of what you'll hear sometimes referred as CFEC. So it's climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. So that was some rulemaking that was done by the state. One of the components of that is a climate-friendly area. So there's a requirement that the city designate a climate-friendly area or areas in the city. And the idea really is that it's a more complete community where people can walk and or ride their bike and don't have to rely on a car to be able to get around. So kind of a more rich, vibrant, mixed-use community. So the state has some pretty specific requirements of where that can be and how it's sized. Right now, the city is doing a pretty comprehensive study to look at where that might be. We've identified areas that are generally already commercial or have some density to them. So you're not going to see these, in low-density residential neighborhoods. And, I would say with the city, we're really well positioned for this because of all the work we did in 2016. Mm-hmm. The regulations are very similar to what's already allowed in Bend Central District, in the Core Pine area, that Timber Yards area I was talking about, Central West Side. It really doesn't. The rules don't deviate much from those requirements.
And I think we're a little bit unique, I think, in the state, in that work we did in 2016 set us up well for these climate-friendly areas. And I think we will end up seeing that somewhere along the lines of the Bend Central District and possibly over by OSU Cascades are likely to be at the top of the list, certainly the Central District, for where we designate. We have to provide in theory, about 30% of our housing units have to be in those areas. So they're going to be much more dense. There will be height. And as we talked about, all that's already starting to happen. We haven't seen a lot of new development yet in the Central District, but there is stuff in the pipeline. And that stuff is going to be vertical. And that's going to start to happen pretty quick here, I think, especially with this money we got for the Midtown crossing. So.
Wow, there's a lot going on. We're so happy that we're going to have you on the point talking about all of this. So thank you for coming on, Mike Riley, the city councilor, and the city planner, BreAnne Gale. We look forward to next month's conversation, the third Friday in September, about housing and space affordability. We'll get into that. So definitely giving you something to talk about. Don't forget to tune in.
Thank you for listening to KPOV's Critical Conversations podcast. To hear weekly interviews on important topics, please visit kpov.org/critical conversations and follow KPOV High Desert Community Radio on Facebook, YouTube, and your favorite podcast app.